Hello everyone, I'm Father Brian Harrison, and I'd like to welcome you to this little video visit of our beautiful and historic St Mary of Victories Church. I've been the pastor here since the beginning of 2012, and I resigned at the end of June 2022 because I'm retiring, going back to my native country. And if you're trying to pick that accent, yes, it's Australia. And so you may be wondering, well, how did I get all the way from Australia to St. Louis, Missouri? I had started my priestly training in Sydney. I had an opportunity to finish up in Rome. I had the great privilege of being ordained by the great Pope St. John Paul II in 1985. And I was ordained to be a priest, first of all, in Puerto Rico. I was there teaching theology in the Catholic University of Puerto Rico for about 18 years. And then I had a chance to come up here to St. Louis, where the community that I belonged to, the Oblates of Wisdom, was given charge of this church by then Archbishop Raymond Burke of St. Louis. So I've been here since 2007, and it's been a wonderful experience for me with this lovely historic church. And I'm very happy that you can watch this video, and we'll go on to say a little bit more about the history of the church and the special features that make it one of the earned it a place on the National Register of Historic Monuments. Well, you're in the beautiful and old historic St Mary of Victories Church, built in 1843. So we've been going for nearly 180 years. It's the second oldest church in the city of St. Louis. I often like to say that, to get a perspective here, we were up and running as a church when Abraham Lincoln was still just a young, unknown lawyer over in Springfield, Illinois, not too far across the river. As you can see, we have a beautiful sanctuary. We have a freestanding altar in the front there with Hungarian embellishments and engraving. This has been the ethnic Hungarian church for about 60 years now. Behind that, you can see the original old high altar with the two angels on either side. That was installed during the Civil War in the 1860s. And we still use that. We sometimes have Latin masses here, traditional style in which the priest faces God, as we say, rather than the people. And so we often use that for Latin masses. Up here you can see the co-patron of our church, Saint Stephen, King of Hungary. He was the first king of Hungary about 1,000 years ago. And this church was originally simply dedicated to St. Mary of Victories. But as of 1956, when the Hungarians had an uprising against the communist regime then in power, there was a little window of freedom, and thousands of Hungarians escaped to freedom in the West, and a lot of them came to St. Louis. So Cardinal Ritter, who was the Archbishop at that time, designated this church as the Hungarian Church. So naturally we have a statue of the founding King of Hungary, Saint Stephen, and he's been the co-patron of our church ever since then. On the corner here you can see a big side altar with a big letter E underneath the altar. That E is for Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, and her picture is above there. She was a Hungarian princess and became married to a German prince and was famous for her charity to the poor. She's there giving out bread to the poor. And that altar was actually placed there by the original German founders of this church because they claim her as their own too. So that side altar is original. What you see here is what we have in Catholic churches. This is a traditional confessional, and with some beautiful stained glass windows here as well. In the Catholic Church, we believe that Jesus delegated the apostles the power to listen to the confessions of sinners and pronounce his forgiveness or absolution in the sacrament of penance or reconciliation, we call it. And so here in the confessional, the priest sits on this side, the penitent comes in, and so anonymity can be observed, which is often a good idea. The penitent can kneel here through the little screen there, tells the priest his or her sins, and the priest will give some advice, tell them something to do, some extra prayers to offer up as a little gift to God in thanksgiving for being forgiven. And then he pronounces the absolution. We believe this is in the scriptures in the 21st chapter of St. John, where on the night of his resurrection the Lord appeared to the disciples and he said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven, and whose sins you retain are retained." The second part of that means that sometimes if the penitent doesn't show true repentance and a determination to avoid the serious sin that he or she is confessing, the priest will sometimes have to say, "You're not quite ready for forgiveness and absolution yet because you're not too sure about giving up the serious sin you've mentioned. So go away and pray, ask the Lord to help you have the grace to make a firm resolution to avoid that sin. Come back, I'll be happy to give you absolution." So that's our little explanation of the Catholic sacrament of penance or reconciliation. It has a couple of names. Here we have another side altar dedicated to St. Stephen of Hungary himself. He's depicted there placing his crown before the Blessed Virgin, who he always says she is the true Queen of Hungary. So that depicts this idea, laying his crown before the Blessed Mother, Our Lady, Queen of Victories. This picture here with a little wreath is a little memorial to the victims of communist oppression who were killed in great numbers during the 1956 uprising. So they're remembered here with honour in our church. Now, the church was originally built as the first German church in St. Louis, and in 1956, well over a century after it was built, it became designated as the Hungarian church as a result of the uprising against communism in 1956, when the Archbishop of St. Louis designated this with a new influx of refugees from Hungary as the Hungarian church. Also Central Europe, an image of the infant Jesus of Prague, and right here a beautiful image of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, to whom the other altar is dedicated. These stations of the cross you see around the walls are actually even older than the church. They were painted in Germany in, I think, the 1830s, and were brought over here by the founders who founded this as a German church in 1843. Some more of our saints at side altars. You have the Blessed Mother as a girl with her mother, St. Anne, St. Anthony of Padua, holding the child Jesus, and one of the first American canonized saints, St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, who founded an order of nuns, was a teaching order. Here in the corner you can see some Hungarian patriots and martyrs who suffered under both the communists and the Nazis. You can see a word that looks like bulldog, B-O-L-D-O-G, Boldog, and that means blessed in Hungarian. A blessed is someone who's been beatified, which in the Catholic Church's procedures is the stage before the canonization of a saint. Someone who's been very holy and the Church honors in a special way is first declared blessed, and then later on, with further investigation and evidence of a miracle worked by that saint's intercession, the Church will declare that that person is a saint. So this is a bishop who was martyred under the Nazis, and this lady here also suffered under the Nazis. You see their dates are 44 and 45. Here in the corner, almost obscured by the fan, this bishop here was a victim of the communist oppression, died in 1951. And this was a famous doctor. He wasn't a martyr, but he was a holy doctor who was known as the doctor of the poor, and who had great charity and service to the sick and needy. Over here you can see a little bit more of the founding history of our church. As you can see, we're on the National Register of Historic Places because of our historic and artistic importance. This plaque here commemorates the Sisters of St. Mary. The first nuns who came out here lived in a convent, which has since been demolished on this south side of the church. And Mother Superior, the nun who in charge, was Mother Mary Odilia Berger. They came in 1873. And they were sisters who carried out works of charity in the area. And although the name of the order was Servants of the Divine Heart, because they were associated with this church, everyone called them the Sisters of St. Mary's, SSM. And that's the origin of what's now the huge, big interstate health organization with a whole bunch of hospitals and thousands of employees throughout the central Midwest states. The SSM network has its origin right here in this church. Here we have a little Lourdes grotto. For those who are maybe not Catholic, not familiar with what this means, in 1858, a young French girl, Bernadette Soubirous, had visions of a beautiful lady who identified herself as the Blessed Virgin Mary. And to testify to the authenticity of this supernatural event, ever since then, since beginning in 1858, when Bernadette was just 14 years old, there's been a whole series of scientifically inexplicable miracles of healing that have taken place with water coming from the grotto at Lourdes. I mentioned before how the first king of Hungary, Saint Stephen, has been canonized as a saint, the founder of Hungary as a Christian nation. It so happens that the very last king of Hungary has also been recognized as a saint by the church, or he's on his way to recognition as a saint. This is Karl I, who was the last emperor of Austria and the last king of Hungary. Austria-Hungary was one great Central European empire after World War I. Emperor Karl came to the throne in the middle of the war. He did everything he could to try to get it ended, but the war went on. And he was the loser, of course. Austria and Germany lost the First World War, and he was exiled to the island of Madeira in the Atlantic, which belonged to it still belongs to Portugal as a neutral power in the war. And he died there at the age of only 34. It was known as a very holy father, husband, head of state. He had wise policies that if the German Kaiser, his ally, had followed, they probably wouldn't have probably wouldn't have had such a disaster in the war, and we might not have even had the rise of communism. That's another long story, but he was had a prophetic understanding of how Lenin, who of course was enabled to come to power with the revolution in Russia in 1917, Kaiser Karl warned his German colleague, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and the top military boss of Germany, don't do anything to allow Lenin to get into power. It will be much worse in the long run. He was right, of course. Russia and the whole of Eastern Europe became slaves to the communist dictatorship because they didn't listen to Karl, and they enabled Lenin to take over in Russia. Here we have an altar to the very well-known and much beloved Saint Therese of Lisieux, often called the Little Flower. She was a nun in Lisieux, France, who died at the age of only 23 or 24 in 1897. And during her short life, she became known as a wonderfully holy nun, very close to Jesus Christ. And she died, I forget exactly what illness, tuberculosis, I think it may have been, very young, but she was canonized some 30 years after that, and has been a wonderfully popular saint in the Catholic Church ever since. We're standing in front of a life-size statue of another priest who we're very proud of here, because he's also been beatified. He's Blessed Francis Xavier Seels, a holy German priest who came out to America in the 1850s, and he was here for 2 weeks in this church in 1865. He became known very quickly as a great friend of the poor and an early champion of racial harmony and equality. He emphasized very much that black and white alike are equal in God's sight, and was became known as a friend of both races. And as you can imagine, Missouri, being a slave state and very deeply divided over the issue, was a state very much riddled by tension and even conflict over the slavery issue. So he came here, he was here for 2 weeks in October 1865, preaching a mission, and he was beatified in the year 2000, declared blessed, and we hope that he'll be canonized as a saint very soon. The altar where he celebrated Mass is the one I indicated at the beginning, the high altar which you will see behind the freestanding altar, the high altar with the green hangings. He celebrated Mass there 2 weeks in 1865. Statue of St. Jude, one of the 12 apostles. He's known in popular Catholic devotion as a saint of lost causes. If something's really seems like you've got no chance of success, something important to you, ask for St. Jude to intercede with God for you, and he's likely to come good. So that's St. Jude. This statue was brought from another earlier church, the old St. Stephen of Hungary church that was here before this one became the Hungarian church. It was dilapidated, fell down. They brought some of the things from that church over to our church here. We have another side altar here dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe, patroness of Mexico. And the painting here is a replica of an extraordinary image that no scientist has ever been able to explain. It dates from 1531, when an old man who was one of the first few converts to Catholicism in Mexico, Juan Diego his name was, had visions of Blessed Mother Mary, and eventually, to show that this was something genuine, the Blessed Mother told him, bring your cloak and pick up these roses. Now that was a miracle in itself, because it was December and roses can't bloom way up in the Mexican, it's at 6,000 feet up or whatever in December. So he put these roses into his cloak and took them to show the bishop, because the bishop said, I don't believe there's been any miracle unless you show me some evidence. As he unfurled his cloak and the roses threw out, an even greater miracle appeared. This image of Mary with stars, the moon at her feet, appeared on his cloak, made of very rough hewn fiber, the kind of material that disintegrates normally after about 20 years. That cloak has remained intact for 500 years. And again, no scientist has ever explained how that image has been. There are no brush marks, it's not a painting. It's something completely inexplicable. And Our Lady of Guadalupe, she's known as, is the patroness of Mexico. And about 100 years ago, I think it was Pope Pius XI declared her also to be the Empress of the Americas, like a patron saint of North and South America alike, because of this wonderful miracle that resulted in the conversion of a great many Mexicans to Christianity back in the 1530s, 40s, 50s, the 16th century. The side altar here you can see is the altar of St. Joseph, underneath a big painting of him at the top. And you can see on the altar between the two vases of flowers is a bronze death mask. That is the death mask of Blessed Francis Xavier Selos, whose life-size statue we saw a few minutes ago and I was explaining to you about before. The altar rails here are original, dating from the 1840s, beautiful German carved altar rails, as is the baptismal font. There have been how many thousands of infants and adults too baptized from that ever since the 1840s. It's the original. This is in honor of Cardinal Joseph Vincenti, who was the leading patriot holding out for resistance against communist tyranny in Hungary. He was the Archbishop of Budapest, the capital, and was imprisoned and tortured by the communist regime in the 1950s. When the revolution occurred in 1956, there was just a little window of freedom. When the communists sent tanks in to crush the revolution, they knew that Vincenti would be sent back to prison and probably shot. And so he took refuge in the US Embassy. President Eisenhower at that time gave special permission for Cardinal Vincenti to take refuge in the US Embassy in Budapest, which of course was under diplomatic immunity. And he was there for 15 years. Finally, in 1971, there was a change, He was released. He came to the United States, visited a few other countries during his last years. And we're very proud of the fact that he came here in 1974, you see 1974 June, and celebrated Mass here at this altar, right beside where we're talking, together with Cardinal Carberry, who was then the Archbishop of St. Louis. It was a packed church, hundreds, standing room only, as you can imagine, because this is the great Hungarian patriot who stood up to communist resistance. It was like an icon of Hungarian national feeling and defender of their honor and of their religion. Vincenti, just 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, in about, I think 2019 or 2019, I think it was, he was declared venerable by the Catholic Church. Venerable is the stage before beatification, and that in turn is the stage before canonization. There are different steps along the road for those the Catholic Church honors as saints, step by step. And so he was declared venerable, which means that his life has been examined, and the evidence from so many people that's taken in these investigations showed that he was a man of heroic sanctity, that he excelled in all the different virtues that the Catholic Church promotes. And so he's well on the way to becoming a saint as well because of his heroic resistance to communism. And we keep this little perpetual candle alight in his honor underneath the plaque that commemorates his visit, and a little photograph of the Cardinal himself. You can get a better view now of the original high altar of our church, which we saw further down there from the floor, which is with this other table in front of it. This was put in the 1860s, flanked by the two angels in adoration. Up on the top, behind the 6 tall candles, you can see panels that are filled with relics of Catholic saints dating back to the earliest, some of the earliest apostles, and ever since then. In the Catholic Church, we believe one of our articles of faith is the resurrection of the body, that when we die, if we're going to heaven, not only our soul, the spiritual part of our being, goes to be with God, but we believe that on the last day, our bodies will rise again, new and immortal, just as Jesus Christ's body rose again from the dead. And therefore, we practice a veneration. We regard the bodies of the saints as something sacred. And so these are little tiny pieces of bone of a great many saints, together with little slips of paper identifying who they are. And these are honored on our altars. As you can see, these little panels with curved tops, arches at the top. On the side altars, we have some other ones in triangular cases. But that's the explanation of what you see there at the back of the altar. And now behind the altar, this is our patroness, Our Lady of Victories. The title of Our Lady of Victories dates back to 1571, when there was a tremendous, great victory of the Christian forces over an invading Turkish fleet that was threatening to overrun Christian Europe. This was the famous Battle of Lepanto, October 7th, 1571, in which the Christian fleet managed to defeat a bigger Turkish fleet that was planning to invade the whole of Western Europe. It was a victory that really saved Christian Europe from being overtaken by the Muslims. Well, that great victory was recognized by the Pope at that time, Pope St. Pius V. And he wanted to declare a feast day in honor of this victory. And since he'd been urging everyone to pray the Rosary and ask the Blessed Mother's intercession to win this battle against the invading Turks, he decided to inaugurate a feast called Our Lady of Victories. Victories plural, because there were other victories and other battles in which the Christian forces had won through the intercession of Our Lady as well. That's the origin of the name of our church. About 60 years later, another pope renamed that feast day the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, because it was by praying the Rosary, they believed that there was the great prayer weapon that was the decisive factor in winning this battle against great odds. So ever since then, October the 7th in the Catholic calendar is celebrated as the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, but it's really the same feast under the original title that we celebrate here, Our Lady of Victories, or Saint Mary of Victories is the official title of the church. And that's the image of her, Mary holding the child Jesus. You can see up the back. You can see in the apse here we have 6 paintings depicting moments in the life of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Here the Annunciation, when the angel announced that she would become the Mother of God. Next to that, her visitation to St. Elizabeth, her elder cousin, who also had conceived miraculously in her having passed the age of childbirth. On the left-hand side, you can see Mary's presentation in the temple, an act of initiation of the Jewish customs at that time, when she was a young girl. And here, of course, she's holding the child Jesus after his birth, with St. Joseph at the side. The 2 pictures at the extreme left and right depict apparitions of the Blessed Mother that occurred during the Middle Ages. Here we see St. Simon Stock, who received the scapula, a little piece of cloth that Our Lady gave him and said this is to be worn in her honour. So that's a little explanation of the paintings we have here. This beautiful little side altar is 150 years old, but the Latin inscription explains that this altar was donated to the church in 1872 by a doctor of theology who had been a Lutheran. And while he was a Lutheran, he had written things against Catholic devotion to Mary, claiming that Catholics are idolaters, they worship Mary and they make her equal with God and this kind of thing. Well, later he himself became a Catholic, and he felt very ashamed after that of having written things against Catholic devotion to the Blessed Mother. And so about a year after he joined this church, in 1871, he had made and donated this beautiful little side altar. And the Latin inscription says this is an act of homage and reparation to the Blessed Virgin by one who is now regrets so much that he, in his ignorance and foolishness, he wrote things against her, and he now regrets that, and this is to make a little offering to her from now one of her grateful sons. You can see up on the top choir gallery a beautifully painted pipe organ. Unfortunately, it is not operative and hasn't been for quite some time. It's one of the few organs around that have been beautifully painted like this. And in fact, the Archdiocese of St. Louis has used a photo of our organ as kind of a logo or a symbol for the big restructuring program, All Things New, that's being carried out at present with a view to restructuring and changing all the parishes in the Archdiocese, or many of them, because of the shortage of priests and the need to consolidate and merge some parishes. It's a very major work affecting 175 parishes, but they've chosen a photograph of our beautiful painted organ pipes as a kind of logo or symbol for that restructuring program and all the things on the website that have to do with that. I'm not too sure when the organ was put in. As I say, long before I came here to this church, it was already inoperative, I'm afraid. We use the electric organ downstairs here now. The green one does, and that one's for the priest inside, but the other one doesn't. We used to have I think this one was supposed to be a red light, and it's not operating at the moment. That's sort of inactive. That needs some repair, I guess, like a number of other things in this church.